Chapter 2, The Internal Prosperity in the Age of the Antonines. Part 1 of the Union and Internal Prosperity of the Roman Empire in the Age of the Antonines. It is not alone by the rapidity or extent of conquest that we should estimate the greatness of Rome. The sovereign of the Russian deserts commands a larger portion of the globe. In the 7th summer after his passage of the Hellespont, Alexander erected the Macedonian trophies on the banks of the Hyphasis. Within less than a century, the irresistible Zingis and the Mogul princes of his race spread their cruel devastations and transient empire from the Sea of China to the confines of Egypt and Germany. 2. But the firm edifice of Roman power was raised and preserved by the wisdom of ages. The obedient provinces of Trajan and the Antonines were united by laws and adorned by arts. They might occasionally suffer from the partial abuse of delegated authority, but the general principle of government was wise, simple, and beneficent. They enjoyed the religion of their ancestors, whilst in civil honors and advantages they were exalted by just degrees to an equality with their conquerors. 1. They were erected about the midway between Lahore and Delhi. The conquests of Alexander in Hindustan were confined to the Punjab, a country watered by the 5 great streams of the Indus. Note, the Hyphasis is one of the 5 rivers which join the Indus or the Sind, after having traversed the province of the Punjab, a name which in Persian signifies 5 rivers. The 5 rivers were 1. The Hydaspes, now the Chelum, Beni or Bedusta, Yesis, the Atesia, Aro Swift. 2. The Assassines, the Chenab, Yisiez, Chandrabhag, Moongift. 3. Hydraotes, the Ravi, or Irauti, Sanskrit Iravati. 4. Hyphasis, the Bea, Sanskrit Vipasa, Fetulis, Sanskrit, the 100 streamed, the Sutlejia, known first to the Greeks in the time of Ptolemy, with the travels of that very able writer. The policy of the emperors and the Senate as far as it concerned religion was happily seconded by the reflections of the enlightened and by the habits of the superstitious part of their subjects. The various modes of worship which prevailed in the Roman world were all considered by the people as equally true, by the philosopher as equally false, and by the magistrate as equally useful. And thus toleration produced not only mutual indulgence but even religious concord. The superstition of the people was not embittered by any mixture of theological rancor, nor was it confined by the chains of any speculative system. The devout polytheist, though fondly attached to his national rites, admitted with implicit faith the different religions of the earth. 3. Fear, gratitude, and curiosity, a dream or an omen, a singular disorder or a distant journey, perpetually disposed him to multiply the articles of his belief and to enlarge the list of his protectors. The thin texture of the pagan mythology was interwoven with various but not discordant materials. As soon as it was allowed that sages and heroes who had lived or who had died for the benefit of their country were exalted to a state of power and immortality, it was universally confessed that they deserved, if not the adoration, at least the reverence of all mankind. The deities of 1,000 groves and 1,000 streams possessed in peace their local and respective influence, nor could the Romans who deprecated the wrath of the Tiber deride the Egyptian who presented his offering to the beneficent genius of the Nile. The visible powers of nature, the planets and the elements, were the same throughout the universe. The invisible governors of the moral world were inevitably cast in a similar mold of fiction and allegory. Every virtue and even vice acquired its divine representative, every art and profession its patron, whose attributes in the most distant ages and countries were uniformly derived from the character of their peculiar votaries. A republic of gods of such opposite tempers and interests required, in every system, the moderating hand of a supreme magistrate who, by the progress of knowledge and flattery, was gradually invested with the sublime perfections of an eternal parent and an omnipotent monarch. 4. Such was the mild spirit of antiquity that the nations were less attentive to the difference than to the resemblance of their religious worship. The Greek, the Roman, and the barbarian, as they met before their respective altars, easily persuaded themselves that under various names and with various ceremonies they adored the same deities. 5. The elegant mythology of Homer gave a beautiful and almost irregular form to the polytheism of the ancient world. 3. Return. There is not any writer who describes in so lively a manner as Herodotus the true genius of polytheism. The best commentary may be found in Mr. Hume's Natural History of Religion, and the best contrast in Bossuet's Universal History. Some obscure traces of an intolerant spirit appear in the conduct of the Egyptians. See Juvenal, Sat, XV, and the Christians, as well as Jews who lived under the Roman Empire, formed a very important exception, so important indeed that the discussion will require a distinct chapter of this work. Note, M. Constant, in his very learned and eloquent work, Sur la Religion, with the 2 additional volumes, Du Polythéisme Romain, has considered the whole history of polytheism in a tone of philosophy which, without subscribing to all his opinions, we may be permitted to admire. The boasted tolerance of polytheism did not rest upon the respect due from society to the freedom of individual opinion. The polytheistic nations, tolerant as they were towards each other, as separate states, were not the less ignorant of the eternal principle, the only basis of enlightened toleration, that everyone has a right to worship God in the manner which seems to him the best. Citizens, on the contrary, were bound to conform to the religion of the state. They had not the liberty to adopt a foreign religion, though that religion might be legally recognized in their own city, for the strangers who were its votaries. Sur la religion, v. 24, Du. Polyth. Rum. E. 38. At this time, the growing religious indifference and the general administration of the empire by Romans who, being strangers, would do no more than protect, not enlist themselves in the cause of the local superstitions, had introduced great laxity. But intolerance was clearly the theory both of the Greek and Roman law. The subject is more fully considered in another place. M4 Return. The rights, powers, and pretensions of the sovereign of Olympus are very clearly described in the Expeath book of the Iliad. In the Greek original, I mean, for Mr. Pope, without perceiving it, has improved the theology of Homer. 2. Note. There is a curious coincidence between Gibbon's expressions and those of the newly recovered De Republica of Cicero, though the argument is rather the converse. Lib. IC 36. Siv has ad utilitatem vita constitut sint a principibus rerum publicarum, ut rex puteretur, onus esse insilo, qui nutu, uta et Homerus totum Olympum converteret, idemque et rex et pathos haberetur omnium. M5 Return. See, for instance, Casal de Bell. Gal. V. 7 Sevils applied to their gods themselves applied to their gods the names of Mercury, Mars, Apollo, and Sea. The philosophers of Greece deduced their morals from the nature of man rather than from that of God. They meditated, however, on the divine nature as a very curious and important speculation, and in the profound inquiry they displayed the strength and weakness of the human understanding. 6. Of the four most celebrated schools, the Stoics and the Platonists endeavored to reconcile the jarring interests of reason and piety. They have left us the most sublime proofs of the existence and perfections of the first cause. But, as it was impossible for them to conceive the creation of matter, the workman in the Stoic philosophy was not sufficiently distinguished from the work, whilst, on the contrary, the spiritual God of Plato and his disciples resembled an idea rather than a substance. The opinions of the academics and Epicureans were of a less religious cast, but whilst the modest science of the former induced them to doubt, the positive ignorance of the latter urged them to deny the providence of a supreme ruler. The spirit of inquiry, prompted by emulation and supported by freedom, had divided the public teachers of philosophy into a variety of contending sects, but the ingenious youth, who from every part resorted to Athens and the other seats of learning in the Roman Empire, were alike instructed in every school to reject and to despise the religion of the multitude. How, indeed, was it possible that a philosopher should accept as divine truths the idle tales of the poets and the incoherent traditions of antiquity, or that he should adore as gods those imperfect beings whom he must have despised as men? Against such unworthy adversaries, Cicero condescended to employ the arms of reason and eloquence, but the satire of Lucian was a much more adequate as well as more efficacious weapon. We may be well assured that a writer conversant with the world would never have ventured to expose the gods of his country to public ridicule had they not already been the objects of secret contempt among the polished and enlightened orders of society. 7 and 6 return. The admirable work of Cicero, De Natura Deorum, is the best clue we have to guide us through the dark and profound abyss. He represents with candor and confutes with subtlety the opinions of the philosophers. 7 returned. I do not pretend to assert that, in this irreligious age, the natural terrors of superstition, dreams, omens, apparitions, and sea had lost their efficacy. Notwithstanding the fashionable irreligion which prevailed in the age of the Antonines, both the interest of the priests and the credulity of the people were sufficiently respected. In their writings and conversation, the philosophers of antiquity asserted the independent dignity of reason, but they resigned their actions to the commands of law and of custom. Viewing, with a smile of pity and indulgence, the various errors of the vulgar, they diligently practiced the ceremonies of their fathers, devoutly frequented the temples of the gods, and sometimes condescending to act a part on the theatre of superstition, they concealed the sentiments of an atheist under the sacerdotal robes. Reasoners of such a temper were scarcely inclined to wrangle about their respective modes of faith or of worship. It was indifferent to them what shape the folly of the multitude might choose to assume, and they approached with the same inward contempt and the same external reverence the altars of the Libyan, the Olympian, or the Capitoline Jupiter. 8 in its return. Socrates, Epicurus, Cicero, and Plutarch always inculcated a decent reverence for the religion of their own country and of mankind. The devotion of Epicurus was assiduous and exemplary. Diogenes. Late. X. 10. It is not easy to conceive from what motives a spirit of persecution could introduce itself into the Roman councils. The magistrates could not be actuated by a blind, though honest bigotry, since the magistrates were themselves philosophers, and the schools of Athens had given laws to the Senate. They could not be impelled by ambition or avarice, as the temporal and ecclesiastical powers were united in the same hands. The pontiffs were chosen among the most illustrious of the senators, and the office of supreme pontiff was constantly exercised by the emperors themselves. They knew and valued the advantages of religion as it is connected with civil government. They encouraged the public festivals which humanized the manners of the people. They managed the arts of divination as a convenient instrument of policy, and they respected, as the firmest bond of society, the useful persuasion that, either in this or in a future life, the crime of perjury is most assuredly punished by the avenging gods. 9. But whilst they acknowledged the general advantages of religion, they were convinced that the various modes of worship contributed alike to the same salutary purposes, and that in every country the form of superstition, which had received the sanction of time and experience, was the best adapted to the climate and to its inhabitants. Avarice and taste very frequently despoiled the vanquished nations of the elegant statues of their gods and the rich ornaments of their temples. 10. But, in the exercise of the religion which they derived from their ancestors, they uniformly experienced the indulgence and even protection of the Roman conquerors. The province of Gaul seems, and indeed only seems, an exception to this universal toleration. Under the specious pretext of abolishing human sacrifices, the emperors Tiberius and Claudius suppressed the dangerous power of the Druids. 11. But the priests themselves, their gods and their altars, subsisted in peaceful obscurity till the final destruction of paganism. 12. 9 return. Polybius, LVC. 53. Fifthly. Juvenal, Sat. ECE, laments that in his time this apprehension had lost much of its effect. 10. Return. See the fate of Syracuse, Tarentum, Ambracia, Corinth, and c. The conduct of Verres in Cicero, Actio EE. Orat. 4. And the usual practice of governors in the Viath satire of Juvenal, 1. Return ni suton. In Claude, Plin, Hist, Nat, XXX, 1. 4-12. Return, Chapel Ren ni steltes war de celtes ton. VP 230-252. Rome, the capital of a great monarchy, was incessantly filled with subjects and strangers from every part of the world, 13, who all introduced and enjoyed the favorite superstitions of their native country. 14. Every city in the empire was justified in maintaining the purity of its ancient ceremonies, and the Roman Senate, using the common privilege, sometimes interposed to check this inundation of foreign rites. 41. The Egyptian superstition, of all the most contemptible and abject, was frequently prohibited, the temples of Serapis and Isis demolished, and their worshippers banished from Rome and Italy. 15. But the zeal of fanaticism prevailed over the cold and feeble efforts of policy. The exiles returned, the proselytes multiplied, the temples were restored with increasing splendor, and Isis and Serapis at length assumed their place among the Roman deities. 51:16. Nor was this indulgence a departure from the old maxims of government. In the purest ages of the Commonwealth, Cybele and Aesculapius had been invited by solemn embassies, 17, and it was customary to tempt the protectors of besieged cities by the promise of more distinguished honors than they possessed in their native country. 18. Rome gradually became the common temple of her subjects, and the freedom of the city was bestowed on all the gods of mankind. 1913. Return. Seneca, Consulat. Ad Helviam, p. 74. Edit. Lips to 14. Return. Dionysius Halicarn. Antiquitat. Roman. Lee. Vol. I. p. 275. Edit. Reisker. 141. Return. Yet the worship of foreign gods at Rome was only guaranteed to the natives of those countries from whence they came. The Romans administered the priestly offices only to the gods of their fathers. Gibbon, throughout the whole preceding sketch of the opinions of the Romans and their subjects, has shown through what causes they were free from religious hatred and its consequences. But, on the other hand, the internal state of these religions, the infidelity and hypocrisy of the upper orders, the indifference towards all religion, in even the better part of the common people, during the last days of the Republic and under the Khazars, and the corrupting principles of the philosophers, had exercised a very pernicious influence on the manners and even on the constitution. W15. Return. In the year of Rome 701, the temple of Isis and Serapis was demolished by the order of the Senate, Dion Cassius, LXL, p. 252, and even by the hands of the consul Valerius Maximus, L3. After the death of Khazar, it was restored at the public expense, Dion, LXLVI, p. 501. When Augustus was in Egypt, he revered the majesty of Serapis, Dion, LE, p. 647. But in the Pomraeum of Rome and a mile round it, he prohibited the worship of the Egyptian gods, Dion, LE, p. 679, Leave, p. 675. They remained, however, very fashionable under his reign, Ovid, De Art, Amond, Li, and that of his successor till the justice of Tiberius was provoked to some acts of severity. See Tacit, Annal, II 85, Joseph Antiquit, LXVI, C3, Antiquit. See the pictures from the walls of Pompeii, the representation of an Isiac temple and worship. Vestiges of Egyptian worship have been traced in Gaul and, I am informed, recently in Britain in excavations at York. The 71 Return. Gibbon here blends into 1-2 events, distant 166 years from each other. It was in the year of Rome 535 that the Senate, having ordered the destruction of the temples of Isis and Serapis, the workman would lend his hand, and the consul, L. Paulus himself, Vala. Max. 1-3 seized the axe to give the first blow. Gibbon attributed this circumstance to the second demolition, which took place in the year 701, and which he considers as the first. W16 return, Tertullian in Apologetic. C6 p. 74. Edit. Haverkamp. I am inclined to attribute their establishment to the devotion of the Flavian family. 17 return, C. Livy, L. She, Supple, and XCXC, return, Macrobe. Saturnalia, Lii, C9. He gives us a form of evocation. 19 return, Minucius Felix in Octavio, p. 54. Arnobius, L.V., p. 1115. Ici, the narrow policy of preserving without any foreign mixture the pure blood of the ancient citizens had checked the fortune and hastened the ruin of Athens and Sparta. The aspiring genius of Rome sacrificed vanity to ambition and deemed it more prudent as well as honorable to adopt virtue and merit for her own wheresoever they were found, among slaves or strangers, enemies or barbarians. 20. During the most flourishing era of the Athenian Commonwealth, the number of citizens gradually decreased from about 3021 to 21,000. 22. If, on the contrary, we study the growth of the Roman Republic, we may discover that, notwithstanding the incessant demands of wars and colonies, the citizens who, in the first census of Servius Tullius, amounted to no more than 83,000, were multiplied before the commencement of the social war to the number of 463,000 men, able to bear arms in the service of their country. 23. When the allies of Rome claimed an equal share of honors and privileges, the Senate indeed preferred the chance of arms to an ignominious concession. The Samnites and the Lucanians paid the severe penalty of their rashness, but the rest of the Italian states, as they successively returned to their duty, were admitted into the bosom of the Republic. 24, and soon contributed to the ruin of public freedom. Under a democratical government, the citizens exercise the powers of sovereignty, and those powers will be first abused and afterwards lost if they are committed to an unwieldy multitude. But when the popular assemblies had been suppressed by the administration of the emperors, the conquerors were distinguished from the vanquished nations only as the first and most honorable order of subjects, and their increase, however rapid, was no longer exposed to the same dangers. Yet the wisest princes who adopted the maxims of Augustus guarded with the strictest care the dignity of the Roman name, and diffused the freedom of the city with a prudent liberality. 25-20 return. 23. Returnen. 24. The Orbis Romanus of the learned Spanheim is a complete history of the progressive admission of Latium, Italy, and the provinces to the freedom of Rome. A note. Democratic states, observes Danina, Della Revolus, di Italia, LIECL, are most jealous of communication. The privileges of citizenship, monarchies or oligarchies willingly multiply the numbers of their free subjects. The most remarkable accessions to the strength of Rome, by the aggregation of conquered and foreign nations, took place under the regal and patrician, we may add, the imperial government. M21 return, Herodotus v. 97. It should seem, however, that he followed a large and popular estimation. 24-2 return, Athenius, De Gnosophist, LVP 272, edit, Casaubon, Mursius de Fortuna Attica, C4. M. On the number of citizens in Athens, compare B. Public Economy of Athens, English TRP 45, et CQ, Fini, Finesi Infasti Hellenici, Vol. A 3081. M23 return, see a very accurate collection of the numbers of each lustrum in M. de Beaufort, République Romaine, LIV, C4. Note, all these questions are placed in an entirely new point of view by Niebuhr, Römische Geschichte, Vol. IP 464. He rejects the census of Servius Fullius as unhistoric, Vol. EIP 78 et CQ, and he establishes the principle that the census comprehended all the confederate cities which had the right of isopolity. M24, return Apian, de Bell, civil, Li, Vellius Paterculus, LIIC, 15, 16, 17, 25. Return Maecenas had advised him to declare by one edict all his subjects citizens. But we may justly suspect that the historian Dion was the author of a counsel so much adapted to the practice of his own age, and so little to that of Augustus. Chapter 2. The Internal Prosperity in the Age of the Antonines. Part 2. Till the privileges of Romans had been progressively extended to all the inhabitants of the empire, an important distinction was preserved between Italy and the provinces. The former was esteemed the center of public unity and the firm basis of the constitution. Italy claimed the birth, or at least the residence, of the emperors and the Senate. 26. The estates of the Italians were exempt from the arbitrary jurisdiction of governors. Their municipal corporations, formed after the perfect model of the capital 261, were entrusted, under the immediate eye of the supreme power, with the execution of the laws. From the foot of the Alps to the extremity of Calabria, all the natives of Italy were born citizens of Rome. Their partial distinctions were obliterated, and they insensibly coalesced into one great nation, united by language, manners, and civil institutions, and equal to the weight of a powerful empire. The Republic gloried in her generous policy, and was frequently rewarded by the merit and services of her adopted sons. Had she always confined the distinction of Romans to the ancient families within the walls of the city, that immortal name would have been deprived of some of its noblest ornaments. Virgil was a native of Mantua. Horace was inclined to doubt whether he should call himself an Apulian or a Lucanian. It was in Padua that an historian was found worthy to record the majestic series of Roman victories. The patriot family of the Catos emerged from Tusculum, and the little town of Arpinum claimed the double honor of producing Marius and Cicero, the former of whom deserved, after Romulus and Camillus, to be styled the third founder of Rome, and the latter, after saving his country from the designs of Catiline, enabled her to contend with Athens for the palm of eloquence. 27-26 Return. The senators were obliged to have 1/3 of their own landed property in Italy. See Plin, LV, Ep 19. The qualification was reduced by Marcus to 1/4. Since the reign of Trajan, Italy had sunk nearer to the level of the provinces. 261 Return. It may be doubted whether the municipal government of the cities was not the old Italian constitution rather than a transcript from that of Rome. The free government of the cities, observes Savigny, was the leading characteristic of Italy. Geschichte der römischen Rechts, IPGM 27 Return. The first part of the Verona Illustrata of the Marquis Maffei gives the clearest and most comprehensive view of the state of Italy under the Caesars. Note, compare Denina, Revol, Den Italia, LII. C. 64. 7d, quote, the 104 to edit. The provinces of the empire, as they have been described in the preceding chapter, were destitute of any public force or constitutional freedom. In Etruria in Greece 28 and in Gaul 29, it was the first care of the Senate to dissolve those dangerous confederacies, which taught mankind that, as the Roman arms prevailed by division, they might be resisted by union. Those princes whom the ostentation of gratitude or generosity permitted for a while to hold a precarious scepter were dismissed from their thrones as soon as they had performed their appointed task of fashioning to the yoke the vanquished nations. The free states and cities which had embraced the cause of Rome were rewarded with a nominal alliance and insensibly sunk into real servitude. The public authority was everywhere exercised by the ministers of the Senate and of the emperors, and that authority was absolute and without control. 2921. But the same salutary maxims of government, which had secured the peace and obedience of Italy, were extended to the most distant conquests. A nation of Romans was gradually formed in the provinces by the double expedient of introducing colonies and of admitting the most faithful and deserving of the provincials to the freedom of Rome. 2000 ab return. See Pausanias vi. The Romans condescended to restore the names of those assemblies when they could no longer be dangerous. 29 Return. They are frequently mentioned by Cazar. The Abbé Dubois attempts, with very little success, to prove that the assemblies of Gaul were continued under the emperors. Histoire de l'établissement de la monarchie françoise, LIC 4 291 Return. This is perhaps rather overstated. Most cities retained the choice of their municipal officers. Some retained valuable privileges. Athens, for instance, in form was still a confederate city. D. Taka. EI 53. These privileges indeed depended entirely on the arbitrary will of the emperor, who revoked or restored them according to his caprice. See Walther Geschichte der römischen Rechts, I 324, an admirable summary of the Roman constitutional history. Me. Wheresoever the Roman conquers, he inhabits, is a very just observation of Seneca. 30 confirmed by history and experience. The natives of Italy, allured by pleasure or by interest, hastened to enjoy the advantages of victory, and we may remark that about 40 years after the reduction of Asia, 80,000 Romans were massacred in one day by the cruel orders of Mithridates. 31. These voluntary exiles were engaged for the most part in the occupations of commerce, agriculture, and the farm of the revenue. But after the legions were rendered permanent by the emperors, the provinces were peopled by a race of soldiers, and the veterans, whether they received the reward of their service in land or in money, usually settled with their families in the country, where they had honorably spent their youth. Throughout the empire, but more particularly in the western parts, the most fertile districts and the most convenient situations were reserved for the establishment of colonies, some of which were of a civil and others of a military nature. In their manners and internal policy, the colonies formed a perfect representation of their great parent, and they were soon endeared to the natives by the ties of friendship and alliance. They effectually diffused a reverence for the Roman name and a desire, which was seldom disappointed, of sharing, in due time, its honors and advantages. 32. The municipal cities insensibly equaled the rank and splendor of the colonies, and in the reign of Hadrian it was disputed which was the preferable condition of those societies which had issued from, or those which had been received into, the bosom of Rome. 33. The right of Latium, as it was called, 331, conferred on the cities to which it had been granted a more partial favor. The magistrates only, at the expiration of their office, assumed the quality of Roman citizens, but as those offices were annual, in a few years they circulated round the principal families. 34. Those of the provincials who were permitted to bear arms in the legions, 35 those who exercised any civil employment, all, in a word, who performed any public service or displayed any personal talents, were rewarded with a present whose value was continually diminished by the increasing liberality of the emperors. Yet even in the age of the Antonines, when the freedom of the city had been bestowed on the greater number of their subjects, it was still accompanied with very solid advantages. The bulk of the people acquired, with that title, the benefit of the Roman laws, particularly in the interesting articles of marriage, testaments, and inheritances, and the road of fortune was open to those whose pretensions were seconded by favor or merit. The grandsons of the Gauls, who had besieged Julius Caesar in Alesia, commanded legions, governed provinces, and were admitted into the Senate of Rome. 36. Their ambition, instead of disturbing the tranquility of the state, was intimately connected with its safety and greatness. 30. Return, Seneca in Consulat. Ad Helvium, c6. 31. Return, Memnon apud Fortium, cc. 33. c. 224 p. 231. Ed Becker. Valle. Maxim, x2. Plutarch and Dion Cassius swelled the massacre to 150,000 citizens, but I should esteem the smaller number to be more than sufficient. 2. Return. 25 colonies were settled in Spain. C. Plin. Hist. Nat. EEE 3, 4, EV 35, and 9 in Britain, of which London, Colchester, Lincoln, Chester, Gloucester, and Bath still remain considerable cities. See Richard of Cirencester, p. 36, and Whitaker's History of Manchester, LIC 3, 33, returned our Gel. Noctes Attica, XV 13. The Emperor Hadrian expressed his surprise that the cities of Utica, Gades, and Italica, which already enjoyed the rights of municipia, should solicit the title of colonies. Their example, however, became fashionable, and the empire was filled with honorary colonies. See Spanheim, De Usu Numismatum Dissertat. G. 331. Return. The right of Latium conferred an exemption from the government of the Roman prefect. Strabo states this distinctly. LAVP 295, edit. Casas. See also Walther, p. 293-3, Ms. 34, return. Spanheim, Orbis Roman, c8, p. 62, 3030 written. Aristi, in Roma Encomio. Tom, IP 218, edit. Gib, 36 return 4, hist. 74. So sensible were the Romans of the influence of language over national manners that it was their most serious care to extend, with the progress of their arms, the use of the Latin tongue. 37. The ancient dialects of Italy, the Sabine, the Etruscan, and the Venetian, sunk into oblivion, but in the provinces the East was less docile than the West to the voice of its victorious preceptors. This obvious difference marked the two portions of the empire with a distinction of colors, which, though it was in some degree concealed during the meridian splendor of prosperity, became gradually more visible as the shades of night descended upon the Roman world. The Western countries were civilized by the same hands which subdued them. As soon as the barbarians were reconciled to obedience, their minds were open to any new impressions of knowledge and politeness. The language of Virgil and Cicero, though with some inevitable mixture of corruption, was so universally adopted in Africa, Spain, Gaul, Britain, and Pannonia, 38, that the faint traces of the Punic or Celtic idioms were preserved only in the mountains or among the peasants. 39. Education and study insensibly inspired the natives of those countries with the sentiments of Romans, and Italy gave fashions as well as laws to her Latin provincials. They solicited with more ardor and obtained with more facility the freedom and honors of the state, supported the national dignity in letters 40 and in arms, and at length, in the person of Trajan, produced an emperor whom the Scipios would not have disowned for their countryman. The situation of the Greeks was very different from that of the barbarians. The former had been long since civilized and corrupted. They had too much taste to relinquish their language, and too much vanity to adopt any foreign institutions. Still preserving the prejudices, after they had lost the virtues of their ancestors, they affected to despise the unpolished manners of the Roman conquerors, whilst they were compelled to respect their superior wisdom and power. 41. Nor was the influence of the Grecian language and sentiments confined to the narrow limits of that once celebrated country. Their empire, by the progress of colonies and conquest, had been diffused from the Adriatic to the Euphrates and the Nile. Asia was covered with Greek cities, and the long reign of the Macedonian kings had introduced a silent revolution into Syria and Egypt. In their pompous courts, those princes united the elegance of Athens with the luxury of the East, and the example of the court was imitated, at an humble distance, by the higher ranks of their subjects. Such was the general division of the Roman Empire into the Latin and Greek languages. To these we may add a third distinction for the body of the natives in Syria, and especially in Egypt, the use of their ancient dialects, by secluding them from the commerce of mankind, checked the improvements of those barbarians. 42. The slothful effeminacy of the former exposed them to the contempt, the sullen ferociousness of the latter excited the aversion of the conquerors. 43. Those nations had submitted to the Roman power, but they seldom desired or deserved the freedom of the city, and it was remarked that more than 230 years elapsed after the ruin of the Ptolemies before an Egyptian was admitted into the Senate of Rome. 4437. Return. See Plin, Hist. Nutter. EEE. 5. Augustine, De Civitate Dei, XC 7. Lipsius de Pronunciatione, Lingua Latina, C3. 38. Return. Apuleius and Augustine will answer for Africa, Strabo for Spain and Gaul, Tacitus in the Life of Agricola for Britain, and Velleius Paterculus for Pannonia. To them we may add the language of the inscriptions. See note, Mr. Hallam contests this assertion as regards Britain. Nor did the Romans ever establish their language. I know not whether they wished to do so in this island, as we perceive by that stubborn British tongue which has survived 2 conquests. In his note, Mr. Hallam examines the passage from Tacitus Agric, XXC, to which Gibbon refers. It merely asserts the progress of Latin studies among the higher orders. Mid Ages, II, 31-4. Probably it was a kind of court language, and that of public affairs, and prevailed in the Roman colonies. M39 Return. The Celtic was preserved in the mountains of Wales, Cornwall, and Armorica. We may observe that Apuleius reproaches an African youth who lived among the populace with the use of the Punic, whilst he had almost forgot Greek, and neither could nor would speak Latin. Apologe, p. 1596. The greater part of St. Austin's congregations were strangers to the Punic. 40. Return. Spain alone produced Columella, the Senecas, Lucan, Martial, and Quintilian. 41. Return. There is not, I believe, from Dionysius to Libanus, a single Greek critic who mentions Virgil or Horace. They seem ignorant that the Romans had any good writers. 42. Return. The curious reader may see in Dupin, Bibliothèque ecclésiastique, tom. Shiksik, p. 1, Cast. 8. How much the use of the Syriac and Egyptian languages was still preserved. 43. Return. See Juvenal, Sat. II, and Exviamien, Marcellin, XEI, 1644. Return. XEI, 1644. Return. Dion Cassius, LLXXVI, p. 1275. The first instance happened under the reign of Septimius Severus. It is a just though trite observation that victorious Rome was herself subdued by the arts of Greece. Those immortal writers who still command the admiration of modern Europe soon became the favorite object of study and imitation in Italy and the western provinces. But the elegant amusements of the Romans were not suffered to interfere with their sound maxims of policy. Whilst they acknowledged the charms of the Greek, they asserted the dignity of the Latin tongue, and the exclusive use of the latter was inflexibly maintained in the administration of civil as well as military government. 45. The two languages exercised at the same time their separate jurisdiction throughout the empire, the former as the natural idiom of science, the latter as the legal dialect of public transactions. Those who united letters with business were equally conversant with both, and it was almost impossible in any province to find a Roman subject of a liberal education who was at once a stranger to the Greek and to the Latin language. 45. Return. See Valerius Maximus, Liic. N2. The Emperor Claudius disfranchised an eminent Grecian for not understanding Latin. He was probably in some public office. Suetonius in Claude, c. 16. Note: causes seem to have been pleaded, even in the Senate, in both languages. Vol. Max. Locke. Seat. Dion. L. Livii. c. 15. Mirth. It was by such institutions that the nations of the empire insensibly melted away into the Roman name and people, but there still remained, in the center of every province and of every family, an unhappy condition of men who endured the weight without sharing the benefits of society. In the free states of antiquity, the domestic slaves were exposed to the wanton rigor of despotism. The perfect settlement of the Roman Empire was preceded by ages of violence and rapine. The slaves consisted, for the most part, of barbarian captives, 451 taken in thousands by the chance of war, purchased at a vile price, 46 accustomed to a life of independence, and impatient to break and to revenge their fetters. Against such internal enemies, whose desperate insurrections had more than once reduced the Republic to the brink of destruction, 47 the most severe 471 regulations, 48, and the most cruel treatment, seemed almost justified by the great law of self-preservation. But when the principal nations of Europe, Asia, and Africa were united under the laws of one sovereign, the source of foreign supplies flowed with much less abundance, and the Romans were reduced to the milder but more tedious method of propagation. 481. In their numerous families, and particularly in their country estates, they encouraged the marriage of their slaves. 482. The sentiments of nature, the habits of education, and the possession of a dependent species of property contributed to alleviate the hardships of servitude. 49. The existence of a slave became an object of greater value, and though his happiness still depended on the temper and circumstances of the master, the humanity of the latter, instead of being restrained by fear, was encouraged by the sense of his own interest. The progress of manners was accelerated by the virtue or policy of the emperors, and by the edicts of Hadrian and the Antonines. The protection of the laws was extended to the most abject part of mankind. The jurisdiction of life and death over the slaves, a power long exercised and often abused, was taken out of private hands and reserved to the magistrates alone. The subterraneous prisons were abolished, and, upon a just complaint of intolerable treatment, the injured slave obtained either his deliverance or a less cruel master. 5451 Return. It was this which rendered the wars so sanguinary and the battles so obstinate. The immortal Robertson, in an excellent discourse on the state of the world at the period of the establishment of Christianity, has traced a picture of the melancholy effects of slavery, in which we find all the depth of his views and the strength of his mind. I shall oppose successively some passages to the reflections of Gibbon. The reader will see, not without interest, the truths which Gibbon appears to have mistaken or voluntarily neglected, developed by one of the best of modern historians. It is important to call them to mind here, in order to establish the facts and their consequences with accuracy. I shall more than once have occasion to employ, for this purpose, the discourse of Robertson. Captives taken in war were, in all probability, the first persons subjected to perpetual servitude. And, when the necessities or luxury of mankind increased the demand for slaves, every new war recruited their number, by reducing the vanquished to that wretched condition. Hence proceeded the fierce and desperate spirit with which wars were carried on among ancient nations. While chains and slavery were the certain lot of the conquered, battles were fought, and towns defended with a rage and obstinacy which nothing but horror at such a fate could have inspired. But, putting an end to the cruel institution of slavery, Christianity extended its mild influences to the practice of war, and that barbarous art, softened by its humane spirit, ceased to be so destructive. Secure, in every event, of personal liberty, the resistance of the vanquished became less obstinate, and the triumph of the victor less cruel. Thus humanity was introduced into the exercise of war, with which it appears to be almost incompatible, and it is to the merciful maxims of Christianity, much more than to any other cause, that we must ascribe the little ferocity and bloodshed which accompany modern victories. G46 Return. In the camp of Lucullus, an ox sold for a drachma, and a slave for 4 drachma, or about 3 shillings. Plutarch, in Lucull, p. 5,000 prisoners were taken in the Jewish war. G. Hist of Jewish war. G. Hist of Jews II. 71. According to a tradition preserved by S. Jerome after the insurrection in the time of Hadrian, they were sold as cheap as horse. Ibid. 24. Compare Blair on Roman slavery. pp. 19. M. Anduro de la Blale, Économie politique des Romains, LIC 15. But I cannot think that this writer has made out his case as to the common price of an agricultural slave being from 2,000 to 2,500 francs 80 L to 100 L. He has overlooked the passages which show the ordinary prices, e.e. Hor, Sat, e.e. V. 45, and argued from extraordinary and exceptional cases. M. 145. The 47. Return Diodorus Siculus in Eclog. Hist. LXXXV. Florus, e.e. 1920. 471 Return. The following is the example. We shall see whether the word severe is here in its place. At the time in which L. Domitius was praetor in Sicily, a slave killed a wild boar of extraordinary size. The praetor, struck by the dexterity and courage of the man, desired to see him. The poor wretch, highly gratified with the distinction, came to present himself before the praetor, in hopes no doubt of praise and reward. But Domitius, on learning that he had only a javelin to attack and kill the boar, ordered him to be instantly crucified, under the barbarous pretext that the law prohibited the use of this weapon, as of all others, to slaves. Perhaps the cruelty of Domitius is less astonishing than the indifference with which the Roman orator relates this circumstance, which affects him so little that he thus expresses himself: durum hoc fortasse videatur, nece ego in ulam patem disputo. This may appear harsh, nor do I give any opinion on the subject, and it is the same orator who exclaims in the same oration, Facinus est cruciare civem Romanum scellus. Verba are, prope parricidium necare, quid dicam in crucem tollere. It is a crime to imprison a Roman citizen, wickedness to scourge, next to parricide to put to death. What shall I call it to crucify? In general, this passage of Gibbon on slavery is full not only of blamable indifference, but of an exaggeration of impartiality which resembles dishonesty. He endeavors to extenuate all that is appalling in the condition and treatment of the slaves. He would make us consider those cruelties as possibly justified by necessity. He then describes with minute accuracy the slightest mitigations of their deplorable condition. He attributes to the virtue or the policy of the emperors the progressive amelioration in the lot of the slaves, and he passes over in silence the most influential cause, that which, after rendering the slaves less miserable, has contributed at length entirely to enfranchise them from their sufferings and their chains, Christianity. It would be easy to accumulate the most frightful, the most agonizing details of the manner in which the Romans treated their slaves. Whole works have been devoted to the description. I content myself with referring to them. Some reflections of Robertson, taken from the discourse already quoted, will make us feel that Gibbon, in tracing the mitigation of the condition of the slaves, up to a period little later than that which witnessed the establishment of Christianity in the world, could not have avoided the acknowledgment of the influence of that beneficent cause, if he had not already determined not to speak of it. Upon establishing despotic government in the Roman Empire, domestic tyranny rose, in a short time, to an astonishing height. In that rank soil, every vice which power nourishes in the great, or oppression engenders in the mean, thrived and grew up apace. It is not the authority of any single detached precept in the gospel, but the spirit and genius of the Christian religion, more powerful than any particular command, which hath abolished the practice of slavery throughout the world. The temper which Christianity inspired was mild and gentle, and the doctrines it taught added such dignity and luster to human nature as rescued it from the dishonorable servitude into which it was sunk. It is in vain, then, that Gibbon pretends to attribute solely to the desire of keeping up the number of slaves the milder conduct which the Romans began to adopt in their favor at the time of the emperors. This cause had hitherto acted in an opposite direction. How came it on a sudden to have a different influence? The masters, he says, encouraged the marriage of their slaves, of the sentiments of nature, the habits of education, contributed to alleviate the hardships of servitude. The children of slaves were the property of their master, who could dispose of or alienate them like the rest of his property. Is it in such a situation, with such notions, that the sentiments of nature unfold themselves, or habits of education become mild and peaceful? We must not attribute to causes inadequate or altogether without force effects which require to explain them a reference to more influential causes, and even if these slighter causes had in effect a manifest influence, we must not forget that they are themselves the effect of a primary, a higher, and more extensive cause, which, in giving to the mind and to the character a more disinterested and more humane bias, disposed men to second or themselves to advance, by their conduct and by the change of manners, the happy results which it tended to produce. I have retained the whole of M. Guizot's note, though, in his zeal for the invaluable blessings of freedom and Christianity, he has done Gibbon injustice. The condition of the slaves was undoubtedly improved under the emperors. What a great authority has said, "The condition of a slave is better under an arbitrary than under a free government." Smith's Wealth of Nations, even 7, is, I believe, supported by the history of all ages and nations. The protecting edicts of Hadrian and the Antonines are historical facts, and can as little be attributed to the influence of Christianity as the milder language of heathen writers, of Seneca, particularly EP. 47, of Pliny, and of Plutarch. The latter influence of Christianity is admitted by Gibbon himself. The subject of Roman slavery has recently been investigated with great diligence in a very modest but valuable volume by W.M. Blair, Esq. Edin, 1833. May we be permitted, while on the subject, to refer to the most splendid passage extant of Mr. Pitt's eloquence, the description of the Roman slave dealer on the shores of Britain, condemning the island to irreclaimable barbarism as a perpetual and prolific nursery of slaves. Speeches, Volume E. P. 80. Gibbon, it should be added, was one of the first and most consistent opponents of the African slave trade. See Hist. Chi XXV, and Letters to Lord Sheffield Misk, Works. M48 returns see a remarkable instance of severity in Cicero in Verum, v. 3481 return. An active slave trade which was carried on in many quarters, particularly the Euxine, the eastern provinces, the coast of Africa, and British, must be taken into the account. Blair, 2332, M482 return. The Romans, as well in the first ages of the Republic as later, allowed to their slaves a kind of marriage, contubernum. Notwithstanding this, luxury made a greater number of slaves in demand. The increase in their population was not sufficient, and recourse was had to the purchase of slaves, which was made even in the provinces of the East subject to the Romans. It is moreover known that slavery is a state little favorable to population. See Hume's essay and Malthus on population, IUSD form 334, G. The testimony of Appian BC, LIC 7, is decisive in favor of the rapid multiplication of the agricultural slaves. It is confirmed by the numbers engaged in the servile wars. Compare also Blair, P. 1119, likewise Columella, LVI. M49 return, C. in Gruter, and the other collectors, a great number of inscriptions addressed by slaves to their wives, children, fellow servants, masters, and c. They are all most probably of the imperial age. 5 return, see the Augustan history, and a dissertation of M. Pyle. De Borini, in the XXXth volume of the Academy of Inscriptions, upon the Roman slaves. Hope, the best comfort of our imperfect condition, was not denied to the Roman slave, and if he had any opportunity of rendering himself either useful or agreeable, he might very naturally expect that the diligence and fidelity of a few years would be rewarded with the inestimable gift of freedom. The benevolence of the master was so frequently prompted by the meaner suggestions of vanity and avarice that the laws found it more necessary to restrain than to encourage a profuse and undistinguishing liberality, which might degenerate into a very dangerous abuse. 51. It was a maxim of ancient jurisprudence that a slave had not any country of his own. He acquired with his liberty an admission into the political society of which his patron was a member. The consequences of this maxim would have prostituted the privileges of the Roman city to a mean and promiscuous multitude. Some seasonable exceptions were therefore provided, and the honorable distinction was confined to such slaves only as, for just causes, and with the approbation of the magistrate, should receive a solemn and legal manumission. Even these chosen freedmen obtained no more than the private rights of citizens, and were rigorously excluded from civil or military honors. Whatever might be the merit or fortune of their sons, they likewise were esteemed unworthy of a seat in the Senate, nor were the traces of a servile origin allowed to be completely obliterated till the 3rd or 4th generation. 52. Without destroying the distinction of ranks, a distant prospect of freedom and honors was presented, even to those whom pride and prejudice almost disdained to number among the human species. 51. Return chapter C. See another dissertation of M. de Berigny in the XXXth volume on the Roman freedman. 52. Return chapter Spanheim, Orbis Roman, LIC 16, p. 24 NC. It was once proposed to discriminate the slaves by a peculiar habit, but it was justly apprehended that there might be some danger in acquainting them with their own numbers. 53. Without interpreting, in their utmost strictness, the liberal appellations of legions and myriads, 54 we may venture to pronounce, that the proportion of slaves who were valued as property was more considerable than that of servants who can be computed only as an expense. 55. The youths of a promising genius were instructed in the arts and sciences, and their price was ascertained by the degree of their skill and talents. 56. Almost every profession, either liberal 57 or mechanical, might be found in the household of an opulent senator. The ministers of pomp and sensuality were multiplied beyond the conception of modern luxury. 58. It was more for the interest of the merchant or manufacturer to purchase than to hire his workmen, and in the country slaves were employed as the cheapest and most laborious instruments of agriculture. To confirm the general observation, and to display the multitude of slaves, we might allege a variety of particular instances. It was discovered, on a very melancholy occasion, that 400 slaves were maintained in a single palace of Rome. 59. The same number of 400 belonged to an estate which an African widow of a very private condition resigned to her son, while she reserved for herself a much larger share of her property. 60. A freedman under the name of Augustus, though his fortune had suffered great losses in the civil wars, left behind him 3,600 yoke of oxen, 250,000 head of smaller cattle, and what was almost included in the description of cattle, 4,116 slaves. 6153. Return. Seneca de Clementia, Lic. 24. The original is much stronger. Quantum periculum eminere nossi serbi nostri nopisenti. 54. Return. Sciplini hist. Natur. LL. XXXX and Athenaeus Dipnosophist. LV. p. 272. The latter boldly asserts that he knew very many Romans who possessed, not for use but ostentation, 10 and even 20,000 slaves. To 75. Return. In Paris there are not more than 43,000 domestics of every sort, and not a 12th part of the inhabitants. Message. Recherches sur la population. p. Ampo 1, Mini 86. 56. Return. A learned slave sold for many £100 sterling. Atticus always bred and taught them himself. Cornell. Nepos in Vitae, K55, on the prices of slaves. Blair, 49. M57. Return. Many of the Roman physicians were slaves. See Dr. Torches. Middleton's Dissertation and Defense. 58. Return. Their ranks and offices are very copiously enumerated by Pignorius to Service. To 59. Return. A tacit. Annal. Exif. 43. They were all executed for not preventing their master's murder. Is note. The remarkable speech of Cassius shows the proud feelings of the Roman aristocracy on this subject. M. Sisti. Return. Apuleius in Apologue. p. 54-8. Edit. Delphin 61. Return. Plin. Hist. Natur. LXXXEI. 47. The number of subjects who acknowledge the laws of Rome, of citizens, of provincials, and of slaves cannot now be fixed with such a degree of accuracy as the importance of the object would deserve. We are informed that when the Emperor Claudius exercised the office of censor, he took an account of 6,945,000 Roman citizens who, with the proportion of women and children, must have amounted to about 20 millions of souls. The multitude of subjects of an inferior rank was uncertain and fluctuating. But after weighing with attention every circumstance which could influence the balance, it seems probable that there existed, in the time of Claudius, about twice as many provincials as there were citizens, of either sex and of every age, and that the slaves were at least equal in number to the free inhabitants of the Roman world. The total amount of this imperfect calculation would rise to about 120 millions of persons, a degree of population which possibly exceeds that of modern Europe. 62, and forms the most numerous society that has ever been united under the same system of government. 6111. Return. 1. Return. According to Robertson, there were twice as many slaves as free citizens. G. Mr. Blair p. 50 estimates 3 slaves to 1 freeman between the conquest of Greece, BC 46, and the reign of Alexander Severus, AD 222-235. The proportion was probably larger in Italy than in the provinces. M., on the other hand, Zumpt, in his dissertation quoted below, p. 86, asserts it to be a gross error in Gibbon to reckon the number of slaves equal to that of the free population. The luxury and magnificence of the great, he observes, of the commencement of the empire, must not be taken as the groundwork of calculations for the whole Roman world. The agricultural laborer and the artisan, in Spain, Gaul, Britain, Syria, and Egypt, maintained himself, as in the present day, by his own labor and that of his household without possessing a single slave. The latter part of my note was intended to suggest this consideration. Yet so completely was slavery rooted in the social system, both in the East and the West, that in the great diffusion of wealth of this time, everyone, I doubt not, who could afford a domestic slave, kept one, and generally the number of slaves was in proportion to the wealth. I do not believe that the cultivation of the soil by slaves was confined to Italy. The holders of large estates in the provinces would probably, either from choice or necessity, adopt the same mode of cultivation. The latifundia, says Pliny, had ruined Italy and had begun to ruin the provinces. Slaves were no doubt employed in agricultural labor to a great extent in Sicily, and were the estates of those 6 enormous landholders who were said to have possessed the whole province of Africa, cultivated altogether by free coloni. Whatever may have been the case in the rural districts, in the towns and cities the household duties were almost entirely discharged by slaves, and vast numbers belonged to the public establishments. I do not, however, differ so far from Zumpt and from M. Dureau de la Malle as to adopt the higher and bolder estimate of Robertson and Mr. Blair, rather than the more cautious suggestions of Gibbon. I would reduce rather than increase the proportion of the slave population. The very ingenious and elaborate calculations of the French writer, by which he deduces the amount of the population from the produce and consumption of corn in Italy, appear to me neither precise nor satisfactory bases for such complicated political arithmetic. I am least satisfied with his views as to the population of the city of Rome, but this point will be more fitly reserved for a note on the 31st chapter of Gibbon. The work, however, of M. Dureau de la Malle is very curious and full on some of the minuter points of Roman statistics. M. 1045.62 return. Compute 20 millions in France, 22 in Germany, 4 in Hungary, 10 in Italy with its islands, 8 in Great Britain and Ireland, 8 in Spain and Portugal, 10 or 12 in the European Russia, 6 in Poland, 6 in Greece and Turkey, 4 in Sweden, 3 in Denmark and Norway, 4 in the Low Countries. The whole would amount to 105 or 107 millions. See Voltaire, de l'Histoire Générale. Gon. Note: the present population of Europe is estimated at 227,700,000. Maltbrun Geograr, Transedit. 1832. See details in the different volumes. Another authority, Almanach de Gotha, quoted in a recent English publication, gives the following details. France, 32.9 million, Germany, including Hungary, Prussian and Austrian Poland, 56.1 million, Italy, 20.5 million, Great Britain and Ireland, 24 million, Spain and Portugal, 14 million, 3.1 million, Russia, including Poland, 44.2 million, Krakow, 128,000, Turkey, including Pachalich of Dichter, 9.5 million, Greece, 637,000, Ionian Islands, 208,000, and Norway, 3.9 million. 2 million, Belgium, 3.5 million, Holland, 2.4 million, Switzerland. Total 219,344,000. Since the publication of my first annotated edition of Gibbon, the subject of the population of the Roman Empire has been investigated by 2 writers of great industry and learning, Mont, Dureau de la Malle, in his Économie politique des Romains, liv. EEC 1-8, and M. Zumpt in a dissertation printed in the Transactions of the Berlin Academy, 1840. M. Dureau de la Malle confines his inquiry almost entirely to the city of Rome and Roman Italy. Zumpt examines at greater length the axiom, which he supposes to have been assumed by Gibbon as unquestionable, that Italy and the Roman world was never so populous as in the time of the Antonines. Though this probably was Gibbon's opinion, he has not stated it so peremptorily as asserted by Mr. Zumpt. It had before been expressly laid down by Hume, and his statement was controverted by Wallace and by Malthus. Gibbon says, p. 84, that there is no reason to believe the country of Italy less populous in the age of the Antonines than in that of Romulus. And Zumpt acknowledges that we have no satisfactory knowledge of the state of Italy at that early age. Zumpt, in my opinion with some reason, takes the period just before the First Punic War, as that in which Roman Italy, all south of the Rubicon, was most populous. From that time, the numbers began to diminish, at first from the enormous waste of life out of the free population in the Forum, and afterwards in the civil wars, from the cultivation of the soil by slaves towards the close of the Republic, from the repugnance to marriage, which resisted alike the dread of legal punishment and the offer of legal immunity and privilege, and from the depravity of manners, which interfered with the procreation, the birth, and the rearing of children. The arguments and the authorities of Zumpt are equally conclusive as to the decline of population in Greece. Still, the details which he himself adduces as to the prosperity and populousness of Asia Minor and the whole of the Roman East, with the advancement of the European provinces, especially Gaul, Spain, and Britain, in civilization and therefore in populousness, for I have no confidence in the vast numbers sometimes assigned to the barbarous inhabitants of these countries, may, I think, fairly compensate for any deduction to be made from Gibbon's general estimate on account of Greece and Italy. Gibbon himself acknowledges his own estimate to be vague and conjectural, and I may venture to recommend the dissertation of Zumpt as deserving respectful consideration. M1A 2050, WT